Imagine this. It is 1841 in Kabul, Afghanistan. The British are supposedly in complete control, yet an event is about to happen that will shake their rule to the core. In the heart of the old city, a huge mob is assembled in the courtyard of a walled compound, home of legendary British super spy Alexander Burns. The mob is angry. They are screaming for Burns and the British to leave. Suddenly, a shot rings out, killing a British officer. Burns, his brother Charles and his bodyguards return fire. Flaming arrows shot by the mob set the compound alight, and Burns knows the game is over. The Burns brothers emerge for a final stand, killing many before being hacked to death by the mob. Upon hearing of Burns' murder, a British officer recalls the words of an Afghan tribal elder when they first invaded Afghanistan. "British, I can see how you'll get your army in, but how will you get them out?" I'm your host, James Barton, and this is Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
First few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada.
The Great Game, the First Anglo-Afghan War. Most listeners will remember the tragic scenes at Kabul International Airport back in 2021, as the West's decades-long war with the Taliban ended in defeat. Yet this was not Britain's first disaster in Afghanistan. In popular history, the First Anglo-Afghan War is vaguely alluded to as an example of imperial overstretch, normally along with comments about Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires. Yet we rarely go into why Britain was there in the first place, let alone why it came to such a tragic end. First, let's set our scene. Our story starts in India. Imagine a private company controlling an entire subcontinent. Sounds like something from a dystopian sci-fi film. Yet by the 1830s, the British East India Company had achieved exactly that. Ruling over 90 million Indians, controlling 70 million acres of land, issuing its own currency, and with its own private army of 200,000 men, they ruled supreme across India and controlled its vast wealth, with some oversight and support from the British government. There was only one cloud on the horizon, the expanding empire of Tsarist Russia. Mind map time. Picture India as an upside-down triangle sticking into the Indian Ocean. At the base of the Indian Triangle to the left, there is a mountainous region. That is where Afghanistan is. Picture it as roughly looking like a circle. Above Afghanistan, there are the vast steppes of Central Asia, filled with ancient kingdoms. As Russia expanded into Central Asia, a deep mistrust and fear began between Britain and Russia. The British became increasingly fearful that Russia would invade India, while Russia feared Britain wanted to expand further and deny it control of Central Asia. This rivalry would lead them to fighting the first modern Cold War, called the Great Game by the British, and I have to admit this is actually my preferred name for the whole rivalry, the Tournament of Shadows by the Russians. It sounds a lot better than the Great Game, even though it's more famous. Adventurous spies would explore this vast region, making and breaking deals with local rulers, all the while trying to gain advantage for their respective countries. The conflict increasingly focused on Afghanistan, the only way Russia could enter India, or the British could access Central Asia, and its ruler, Emir Dost Muhammad Khan. Britain would invade Afghanistan due to a tangled web of rivalries, jealousies and arrogance between three men. The first was Lord Auckland, Governor-General of India, a rather arrogant man in a job far above his abilities. A confirmed bachelor of 51, he made little secret of how bored he was with the bourgeois civil servants and obsequious Rajas he was forced to mix with. He'd only accepted the job as he had failed in British politics. A proud man, he had become obsessed with removing Dost Muhammad, after the emir had rejected a rather insulting and arrogant demand to expel a Russian embassy. The next was Auckland's close collaborator William Macnaghten, a former High Court judge and a foppish dandy who insisted on wearing blue-tinted spectacles to keep up with the latest London trends. He was dismissed by one British officer as, "He is ignorant of men even to simplicity, and utterly incapable of forming and guiding administrative measures." A deeply ambitious man who thought an Afghan war would advance his career, he famously said, "Friends, we have a beautiful game on our hands, if we have the means and inclination to play it properly." He was also deeply jealous of the final man in our trio, Alexander Burns. Master spy, famous explorer, handsome, a combination of James Bond and Indiana Jones, and still only in his 20s. He opposed the drift to war, but was overruled by Auckland and Macnaghten. A 20,000-strong British Indian force was assembled to invade Afghanistan and replace the emir with his old rival, Shah Shuja, who was thought to be more pliable and sympathetic to British interests. The invasion ran into problems straight away, perhaps foreshadowing the disaster that was to come. Local sultans at first delayed and then refused to allow the army to pass through their territory, denying them the easier route through the mountains, using the Khyber Pass to enter Afghanistan. Having arrived in their winter kit, they would now have to lumber through vast deserts in 42-degree heat and head towards the much harder Bolan Pass route. Expecting an easy victory, the British brought all the luxuries of home, creating a ludicrously large baggage train of 38,000 camp followers and 30,000 camels. Honestly, the things they decided were essential to take with them resemble something from a carry-on film. One regiment took its pack of foxhounds. Another took 2 camels to carry its cigarettes. Lady Sale, wife of Fighting Bob Sale, the only general to come out of Afghanistan with some credit, decided to take a grand piano. A brigadier general took 50 camels to carry his essential items, while another general took 160. 300 camels were used for the military wine cellar. Even junior officers travelled with 40 servants each, ranging from cooks to masseurs. A huge army of prostitutes also travelled with them, while one camel was even designated to carry eau de cologne for high-ranking officers. Upon seeing this, one general exclaimed that many young officers would as soon as have thought of leaving behind their swords and double-barreled pistols as march without their dressing cases, their perfumes, Windsor soap and eau de cologne. One regiment has 2 camels carrying the best Manila cigars, while other camels carry jams, pickles, cheroots, potted fish, hermetically sealed meats, plate, glass, crockery, wax candles, and table linen. To understand how ridiculous this was, they were about to trek through some of the harshest terrain on Earth, through passes controlled by hostile tribesmen. They were acting like they were going on a large-scale picnic. All this, yet they had forgotten to bring enough food for the journey. The army was only saved from starving to death by the quick thinking of Burns, who bought 10,000 sheep at an extremely high markup from local shepherds. Must have been a good time to be a local shepherd. A huge army appears and suddenly wants to buy your entire flock of sheep. All the while, Macnaghten, the head of the expedition, refused to get involved as he was translating Arabian Nights while riding an elephant. The heat played havoc with the troops, especially as they were in their winter uniforms. By the time they reached the Bolan Pass, half the army was already dead from dehydration and heat-related ailments. The pass itself was a mountainous, narrow, 55-mile-long killing zone, perfect for sniping and ambushes from above. Imagine this. You are a British officer riding through the pass. The walls of the pass tower above you like giants. The road is terrible and impossible for artillery to move on. Cannons had to be broken up and moved solely by manual labour. Sometimes it is so steep, camels and horses refuse to move up. Other times it is so narrow, only 2 men can fit through at the same time. You are under almost constant sniper fire from local tribesmen. Starvation haunts the army, as 49 camel loads of grain were seized by the local tribesmen in an ambush. The sight of mutilated bodies of camp followers left behind still haunt you. Yet you keep going. There is no turning back through the pass. Either you will make it through to the other side, or you will die. There is no in between. Again, the army was saved by Burns, who was able to bribe the local tribesmen to stop attacking, and even to provide the army with 7,000 sheep, once again saving them from starvation. Eventually, the battered army made its way through the pass, capturing Afghanistan's southern capital of Kandahar with no resistance. This was mainly because the Afghans couldn't believe someone would try the Bolan Pass in the middle of summer, so they at least had the advantage of surprise. Through the judicious use of bribes, the army continued its run of successes until it ran into the great fortress of Ghazni. British intelligence of the region was so bad they thought Ghazni had no walls and was defenceless. Instead, they encountered a fortress that stood on a mountain top and was surrounded by high walls that were 60 feet thick. Though the army still had plenty of tobacco and wine and its grand piano, yes, that had managed to get through the pass, they had forgotten to bring any siege guns. Once again, the campaign stood in the balance. Still, their luck continued to hold. Incredibly, a Kashmiri in the service of Burns, named Mahan Lal, knew Ghazni well and had contacts within the city. Lal proved to be an excellent spy, and through his intelligence sources inside Ghazni, the British learned that all but one of the city's gates had been walled up from the inside by its defenders. Imagine this. As the British launch a diversionary attack on the fortress, a terrible storm descends upon the battlefield. While the Afghans are distracted, a small party of sappers carry 300 pounds of gunpowder to the one gate that has not been bricked up. It is terrifying work, at the risk of discovery at any moment. Finally, you reach the gate as the storm howls around you. You try to light the fuse, but the rain and the wind are making it impossible. You frantically keep trying, but with no luck. Suddenly, the fuse ignites, and you run back the way you came, barely reaching safety in time before a huge explosion rips through the air, and the gate is blown to pieces. Your heart pounds at your narrow escape as British troops pour through the opening. Ghazni has fallen. The Afghans lost over 1,200 dead, the British just 17. In the face of these staggering victories, Afghan resistance crumbled. Dost Mohammed fled, and the British walked into Kabul unopposed. Yet even now there were warning signs of what was ahead. Their replacement Emir Shah Shuja turned out to be very unpopular among Afghans. No cheers greeted his entrance into Kabul, the crowds sullen and angry at him as he went past. A former advisor to Dost Mohammed screamed at Burns that, "You have brought him by your money and arms into Afghanistan. Leave him now with us. Let him rule over us if he can." As long as Afghans feared British power, Shah Shuja was safe. If that ever changed, he was a dead man, along with his British allies. Macnaghten crowed about his victory, boasting that he had proved all the naysayers wrong. Made a baron for his great victory, he was soon in sole charge of the Afghan mission as the majority of his army went back to India. Filled with hubris, Macnaghten sidelined Burns and ignored his advice, embarking on some truly catastrophic decisions. The overconfident British began to treat their occupation of Kabul as something of a holiday. Rather than remain in Kabul's most forbidding fortress, the Bala Hissar, they decided to build a vast camp on an open plain outside the city, mainly for its natural beauty and fine polo fields. The army began devoting itself to pleasure, with life in the camp revolving around hunting jackals with foxhounds, polo matches, epic drinking sessions, cricket matches, afternoon horse rides, and piano recitals. Lady Sale even started planting a kitchen garden. It was a blissful life, yet the British had effectively built a trap for themselves. The camp was completely indefensible. Irrigation ditches snaked around it, providing a ready-made trench system for any would-be attackers. Even worse, it was surrounded by hills filled with ancient ruins, perfect territory for snipers or even just for spying on the camp. The final nail in the coffin was the supplies and ammunition were stored outside the camp miles away. This is probably one of the worst decisions. I can only assume they became massively overconfident. To avoid disaster, the British desperately needed an able military commander. Instead, they got one of the worst generals in the history of the British Army. Major General William Elphinstone, or Elfie Bay as I'll be calling him, and as that was his nickname in Afghanistan, was a befuddled, gout-ridden 60-year-old who hadn't seen combat since the Napoleonic Wars. A senior British officer called him the most incompetent soldier who ever became a general. He would spend most of his time in Afghanistan bedridden due to his gout and rheumatisms. If all this was not enough, the British now seemed to go out of their way to upset the Afghan population. Shah Shuja had promised MacNaughton that Afghanistan was a land of plenty and a great market for British goods. Instead it was dirt poor, and garrisoning it had become an increasing drain on the East India Company's finances. Remember, it was a private company that wanted to make a profit to appease its shareholders. As a cost-cutting measure, they abolished the subsidies they were paying to Afghan tribal chiefs to keep them loyal. Almost immediately, British supply columns began to be attacked, while messengers were found with their throats slit. Then, they allowed Shah Shuja to drastically raise taxes, mainly to pay for his own vices, further outraging Afghan opinion. A resistance movement began to arise, and reports reached the camp of British forts guarding the route back to India being attacked. In their own little bubble, though, Elfie Bay and MacNaughton ignored these reports as mere gossip. The final slap in the face was that British troops began fraternising with Afghan women, a huge offence in Afghan culture. Ironically, the main offender was Alexander Burns. With little to do after being sidelined by MacNaughton, he had turned to wine on local women for comfort. It was his escapades that would provide the final spark. As the winter snows arrived, cutting off the British from reinforcement and resupply from India, Burns became involved with the youngest wife of a leading Afghan tribal elder. She eventually fled her husband's house to live with Burns in his Kabul compound. The outraged husband appealed to the mobs of Kabul to help him avenge this dishonour. We are now at the scene we started this podcast with, as Burns met his fate at the hands of the mob. His big mistake had been to trust that nearby British troops would rush to his aid. Afghans themselves were shocked over the inaction. They waited with bated breath for retaliation from the British. Yet, nothing happened. What was going on? The problem was with the duo of MacNaughton and Elfie Bay. MacNaughton seemed paralysed by the situation, unable and unwilling to issue any commands. Elfie Bay's behaviour was even more bizarre. Despite being in the same camp with MacNaughton, he chose not actually to have a meeting with him. Instead, he wrote numerous letters to him asking for advice. These were filled with insights such as, "Our dilemma is a difficult one," and "We must see what the morning brings." According to Lady Sale, General Elphinstone vacillates on every point. His own judgment appears to be good, but he's swayed by the last speaker. The outcome of this paralysis in command was that no help was sent to Burns. This was despite British troops being a mere 5 minutes away. When no British retaliation occurred, the Afghan mobs became bolder. The ridiculous decision to store British supplies and ammunition far away from the camp and leave them undefended meant they were soon overrun by the Afghans. They captured the British cannons and spare rifles, and then started to shell the British camp with their own cannon. The situation became worse when Elfie Bay fell off his horse, and then the horse fell on him, leaving him an invalid for the rest of the disaster that followed. The rebels had now entered Kabul and joined the mob, led by the charismatic son of Dost Muhammad, Muhammad Akbar Khan. Akbar was something of a celebrity in Afghanistan, famed for his good looks, intelligence, and fighting ability. He would prove more than a match for the British. MacNaughton still thought he could save the situation, negotiating with Akbar while at the same time scheming to have him assassinated. Once again, however, MacNaughton was being too clever for his own good. Akbar found out about the plot to kill him, and he was not pleased. A meeting was arranged to discuss a final agreement, with the British leaving and Akbar becoming chief advisor to Shah Shuja, who would remain emir in title only. Macnaghten had asked Elfi Bey for a military escort. However, in another show of incompetence, Elfi Bey forgot to send one. Macnaghten, overconfident as usual, decided to press ahead despite warnings of possible treachery. Now, imagine this scene. Macnaghten strides out of the camp into the snow with just 3 military aides for support, his blue-tinted glasses glinting in the winter sun. Ahead lies Muhammad Akbar. You notice his retinue is larger than you agreed. However, Macnaghten dismisses your concerns as trivial. He warmly greets Akbar and presents him with 2 pistols that Akbar had admired previously as a gift. You can't shake the feeling that something is wrong, noticing Akbar's smiles do not reach his eyes. Akbar asks Macnaghten if the new conditions were acceptable, and as Macnaghten replies jovially, "Why not?" then the mask seems to drop. Akbar's face now bears a mixed look of anger, hate, and glee. With a subtle movement he signals to his men, and suddenly they fall upon you, tying you up. A terrified Macnaghten is dragged towards Akbar, screaming, "For God's sake!" where he is shot to death with the same pistols he had given Akbar as a gift. Thrown across a horse, you are carted off to Kabul in captivity. So dies the architect of the whole invasion, his body displayed in the Kabul bazaar. Think of it as a main marketplace. Elfi Bey now finally attempted to break out, but inevitably in the most incompetent way possible. He ordered General Shelton, another Napoleonic War veteran who hadn't seen action since Waterloo, to lead a force out of the camp and engage the Afghans. Shelton thought the tactics that had worked against Napoleon at Waterloo would also work decades later in different terrain in Afghanistan. His troops formed a square, a tactic often used against cavalry in Europe. They waited for the Afghans to charge them. The Afghans didn't charge, however. Instead, they held back and sniped at the rows of troops. The Jazeo rifles that they wielded were difficult to use and reload, but they could accurately hit a target from over half a mile away. For 2 hours, Shelton's troops died in droves from sniper fire, while the general seemed unsure what to do next. Finally, he retreated but was then ambushed by the Afghan cavalry. Only a quarter of his force survived to return to the camp. With this defeat, British morale was broken. Elfi Bey began negotiations with Akbar Khan for the British to evacuate Kabul. However, by this time, Akbar had no interest in allowing the army to leave Afghanistan. He wanted to destroy it as both a punishment for the invasion and a warning never to try again. He cleverly allowed the negotiations to drag on, while setting in place plans for multiple ambushes to destroy the British army. After finally giving the British permission to leave, 17,000 soldiers and camp followers left the Kabul garrison and started trudging through the snow. Elfi Bey was begged by his officers to instead pretend they were leaving and then make a break for the Bala Hissar fortress, where Shah Shuja was still besieged. Elfi Bey refused as he had given his word, guaranteeing the destruction of his army. Their destination was British-held Jalalabad, and they had been promised a military escort by Akbar, which, mysteriously or not, never arrived. Behind them, looters raced into the now abandoned camp, snatching everything they could move. Sniper fire from the camp began picking off the soldiers at the rear of the army, while Afghan horsemen repeatedly attacked, killing many. By the end of the first day, the army had only progressed 5 miles and had to camp, ironically, where the future Kabul airport I mentioned at the start of this episode will be built. In the distance, the sky turned red as the Afghans set fire to their abandoned camp. There could be no return now. They would have to go forward into the snow. As the night cold set in, we must remember that the vast majority of the troops were Indian soldiers, or sepoys as they were called. They were recruited mainly from extremely hot areas and had little experience of dealing with the Afghan winter. They lay down in the snow to sleep. The next day, many had died from the cold, while others had contracted frostbite. As they marched on, the ambushes continued, just as Akbar had planned. Akbar now showed how cunning he could be. He met the retreating British and was suddenly all smiles, blaming local tribesmen for the ambushes, and Elfie Bey himself for not waiting for the military escort. Despite being warned that this was a trick, Elfie Bey was desperate to believe him. When Akbar cleverly asked for hostages as a guarantee and picked the remaining most experienced officers, Elfie Bey agreed. The women and children were also sent with Akbar for their safety, of course. Despite his promises, the ambushes continued and became far more deadly. At one point, survivors report Akbar himself riding amongst the carnage, imploring the Afghans in Persian, a language he knew many British officers understood, to stop the killing. All the while in his own tongue, telling his followers to kill everyone and leave no survivors. Only 6 days into the march and the army had been decimated and military order was breaking down. Out of the 17,000 who'd left Kabul, only 200 soldiers and 2,000 civilians remained. Akbar once again approached what was left of the army, protesting he wasn't responsible for the attacks, and asked for a meeting to resolve these issues. Once again, Elfie Bey believed him. He seems a man who today's conmen and scammers would love to meet. Upon entering Akbar's camp, Elfie Bey and the rest of his senior commanders were seized and became prisoners of war. Now leaderless, though let's face it, this may have been an improvement, the survivors made a desperate attempt to finally get out of Afghanistan. There was one last mountain pass they had to cross, Jagdalak. Here, Muhammad Akbar had laid his most diabolical trap. At the mouth of the Jagdalak Pass, a man-made barrier of thorn bushes had been erected to completely block the entrance. The desperate remnants of the army tried to clear a path through the thorns, when behind them came the sounds of gunfire. Imagine this. As you turn from the thorn bushes and look behind, the hills are alive with Afghan warriors as they charge towards you, screaming their battle cries. It is as though the entire mountainside is falling on you at once. A mad, murderous rush descends upon the survivors as the Afghans start hacking and shooting at you. Pressed against the thorn bushes, you desperately try to clear a way through. Finally you break through and escape to the other side. In the distance you can hear the screams as the last remnants of the British army that invaded Afghanistan is destroyed. Only 80 men got through the thorn bushes. The rest were killed at Jagdalak. They split into two groups, those with horses and those without. The group on foot were surrounded at a place called Gandamak. Choosing to die with honour, they fixed bayonets and fought to the last man, killing many Afghans. Only one officer, a Captain Suter, survived as he had wrapped the Union Jack flag around himself to save it. The Afghan tribesmen assumed that a prisoner who was so valuably dressed and standing out must be a very wealthy man, or at least very important, and they kept him alive to be ransomed. Those on horses fared little better. One by one they were picked off until only one remained, a Dr. William Bryden. With his colleagues dead, he frantically rode towards Jalalabad and safety. Repeatedly attacked by the Afghans, he came close to being shot when a bullet smashed into his sabre, snapping off the blade. He was reduced to driving off the Afghan cavalry by literally punching him in the face with the leftover hilt of his sabre. Bloody, battered and bruised, he could finally see Jalalabad in the distance. The Afghans melted away and a British relief force rescued him. Out of the 17,000 men, women and even children who had left from Kabul, only one man had reached their destination. This was the most devastating defeat the British Empire suffered in the 19th century and earned Afghanistan its modern title of the Graveyard of Empires. Yet it could have been avoided. It was the criminal incompetence of Macnaghten and Elfie Bey that would lead to the destruction of the British force in Kabul. Whenever there was a chance to make a bad decision, they seemed to leap on it with enthusiasm. Their time in Kabul is a masterclass in how not to run a military campaign. At Kandahar and Jalalabad, British garrisons remained in control under competent officers, showing what could have been possible in Kabul. Ironically, these officers had been blocked from commands in Kabul by Lord Auckland. This was due to their middle-class origins, and in one case, extraordinarily, because the officer had a regional accent. Auckland had preferred the impeccably spoken and bred McNaughton and Elfie Bay, dooming the army in the process. Auckland too must be blamed for the decision to cut off bribes to the Afghan tribal leaders. This wasn't the end for the British in Afghanistan. An army of retribution was launched in the spring that went on a rampage for Afghanistan, destroying and shooting everything in its path. They reached Kabul in mere months, only to find that Shah Shuja had been killed by Akbar in the meantime. After destroying the Kabul bazaar in revenge, they found out Akbar was still holding 22 officers and 37 soldiers, 19 women and 22 children hostage, and was preparing to sell them into slavery. Thankfully, their jailers had second thoughts as the British Army smashed their way across Afghanistan, helped by a bribe from other hostages that they'd managed to hide until now. Becoming more like bodyguards than jailers, they handed over the hostages to the British and were richly rewarded again. Elfie Bay, though, had died in captivity, never having recovered from the wounds inflicted when his horse fell on him. With Britain back in force, Muhammad Akbar disappeared from the history books with the second fall of Kabul. There is a legend he was killed by a rival after being promised safe passage. If true, it was a fitting fate for him. The British were not here to stay, though. They had learnt their lesson. Afghanistan was easy to conquer, but impossible to keep. They cast around for a new emir who could be relied upon to keep Afghanistan quiet and keep the Russians out. They found one, actually, an exiled former emir who has come up previously in our story. His name was Dost Muhammad Khan. Yes, that's right. After all that horror and bloodshed, Britain decided to put the original emir back in charge, who they had invaded in the first place, to remove. He would rule Afghanistan as a friend of Britain until his death. The Russians would never gain a foothold in Afghanistan during his reign. Famously, he would say, "What I cannot understand is why the rulers of so vast and flourishing an empire should have gone across the Indus to deprive me of my poor barren country." As for the East India Company, its reputation for invincibility had been shattered, and foes began to circle. The Sikh Empire would try and conquer India, while later the company army that had taken the most casualties in Afghanistan, the Bengal Army, would rebel in the greatest threat to British rule in India before the Second World War. But these are for later episodes. In the West, we have forgotten most of our imperial wars since the European empires fell. However, while we may have short memories, others certainly don't. When British troops were deployed to Helmand province in the 21st century, they were surprised by the hostility they faced. A tribal elder informed the mystified British officers that they should never have returned. His ancestors had driven them out before, and he would do so again. In the end, he would keep his pledge. Another echo of this conflict, Mohammad Karzai, the first leader of Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban, was a descendant of Shah Shuja. His difficult relationship with the West was fed by his determination not to end up like his ancestor. A British Army chaplain, G.R. Gleig, summed up the First Anglo-Afghan War perfectly as a war begun for no wise purpose, carried on with a strange mixture of rashness and timidity, brought to a close after suffering and disaster, without much glory attached either to the government which directed or the great body of troops which waged it. Not one benefit, political or military, was acquired with this war. Our eventual evacuation of the country resembled the retreat of an army defeated. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating, write a review or subscribe. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.